Okay, we are on Banner in the Sky, chapter 17. The first beams of the rising sun struck the summit of the citadel and kindled it into white fire. Moments later, they touched the tops of the lesser peaks, and a tide of light flowed from the heights, down the cliffs and ridges, along the snowfields and glaciers, over the forests and meadows, into the valley below. Last of all, it reached the village of Kurtal. Its bright rays glittered on the church spire, the shop windows, and the polished brass of the telescope that stood on the terrace before the Beau Site Hotel. Even at this hour, there was a crowd around the square, for Kurtal had borne no resemblance to its usual peaceful self since Paul Toglich had come down with the word that the climb had begun. The southeast ridge of the mountain was not visible from the town, but the shoulder and all above it were in plain view, and since noon of the day before, which according to Toglich was when the climbers might have appeared, a steady procession of watchers had been peering up at the heights. So far, however, they had seen nothing. They had remained at the telescope until night closed in. Now, with the sunrise, they were back again, but they still had seen no hint of life or movement on the soaring pinnacle of the mountain. Overnight, the mood of the town had changed. On the previous day, it had been a holiday atmosphere. There had been a buzzing of excitement, a joyful pride, almost as if the peak had already been won. But now, in the first morning light, voices were muted and faces tense. True, there was not yet real cause for worry. These were mountain people, and they knew that on a mountain there could be all manner of obstacles and delays. But they knew, too, from Toglich, that the climbers had food for only 3 days. If they were to succeed, if they were to appear on the shoulder and go on to the summit, it must be this morning, or not at all. The sun climbed the sky. It grew brighter. A hush lay upon the town. There were hundreds of searching eyes, but only the one telescope, and this was reserved for the use of the senior guides. The single exception was Herr Hempel, the fat proprietor of the Beau Site Hotel, who, as owner of the instrument, had first priority of all, and who stayed at it twice as long as anyone else, focusing, more often than not, on an entirely wrong part of the mountain. "Where are they? Where?" he demanded, his moon face clouded with worry, as he reluctantly stepped aside. The guides did not answer. Hans Andermatt, and then Paul Toglich, and then Joanne Feinier peered in turn through the lenses, and no one spoke until Herr Hempel took it over again. "It is that Saxo," he declared, "the man from Broly. He has delayed them." And a moment later, "He could not go on. The others have had to bring him down." "If they came down yesterday," said Hans Andermatt, "the men in the hut would have known it. They would have sent word here." The crowd thickened. Every man and child was in the streets. And among them, coming along the main street toward the central square, was Frau Matt. She had been to early mass at the church and prayed for the safety of her brother Franz. And as she now walked along, she murmured another prayer, this one of thankfulness that at least her son was safe. For 2 days following Rudy's disappearance, she had suffered agonies of uncertainty and fear. But with Paul Toglich's appearance, the worst of them at least had ended, for Toglich had assured her that the boy was not on the mountain. Franz had gone, yes, he had said. Franz and Captain Winter and Saxo, those 3. But Rudy had stayed safe in the hut with the support party. Though she was upset and concerned about Franz, he was at least a grown man. He could take care of himself. But with Rudy, it was different. He was a boy, her son, her one and only son. And she was thankful. Now she reached the square in front of the hotel and approached the crowd around the telescope. She did not need to ask questions. She could tell without asking that they had seen nothing yet. "Do not worry, Frau Matt," said Johann Fregner gently. "They are all right. They will soon appear." "Your brother will get them there," Hans Andermatt assured her. "If only that Saxo does not spoil it at all," muttered Herr Hempel. There was a silence. The men took their turns at the telescope, and as each left it, he slowly shook his head. Frau Matt stood by with the others for a while and then turned quietly to go on her way. "Yes, it is better you wait at home," Herr Hempel told her. "Be calm, be hopeful, and we shall call you as soon as—" He never finished. His glance moved suddenly past her to Joanne Feinier, who was now at the telescope, for Feiner's body had gone rigid. His hands gripped the shaft. In the next instant, one hand was raised commandingly, and a deathly stillness filled the square. Then, "They're there!" Feinier cried. "I see them! They're there!" The stillness exploded into a roaring shout. Through the mass sound came a volley of individual voices. "Where? Where? Where?" Feiner's hand was still raised, and now others were raised too for silence. "On the shoulder," he said. His eye remained glued to the telescope. "A little above the shoulder, on a slope of snow under the summit ridge." The crowd hummed with excitement. How near the top?" they yelled. "How many of them? Are they moving?" "Yes, they are moving," said Feinier. Up the snow now. They are only specks, but I can see them clearly. 2 small black specks." "Only 2? "Yes, 2. "Which 2? Where are the others?" "I cannot tell which 2. I can see nothing but—" The rest of what Feinier said was lost in the hubbub. Herr Hempel was trying to push him from the telescope, but he would not budge. Voices sounded from all sides, questioning, clamoring. Where can the others be? They have turned back, or fallen. You told us they went 4 on one rope, said Hans Andermatt to Paul Toglich. Yes, when they started, but they could have changed higher up. If they changed, how would they split up? Captain Winter and Saxo, probably. And Franz with Rudy. Yes. Perhaps the boy could not make it, said Andermatt. Then Franz would have had to stay with him, and... He stopped. His words hung in the air. He realized that Frau Matt had not left, but was standing there watching him. I mean, he stammered, and again stopped. There was a silence. For a moment the telescope was forgotten, and all eyes turned to the small, faded woman who stood there alone among the guides of Kurtal. You mean, said Frau Matt very quietly, that my boy's son is on the citadel? Andermatt did not answer. No one answered, and her gaze moved slowly to Paul Toglich, who stood awkwardly among the others. You lied to me, she said. Her lips trembled. Her face was chalk white. In the next instant, it seemed the storm within her would break out in a flood of anguish and anger. But the instant did not come. Instead, a strange thing happened, a remarkable thing happened, that the people of Kurtal were to remember for years to come. The trembling of her lips ceased. Her face grew calm. And her voice, when she spoke again, was even quieter than before. You lied to me, she repeated. You have all lied to me. But that is all right. I am not angry. It was kind of you to try to spare me worry for my son. She paused. No, I did not want him to go. I have not wanted him to be a guide, and all of you know the reason. But it was not a good reason. I know that now. I think I have known it in my heart all along. No, it was not you who were wrong in lying, but I in causing you to lie, in being afraid to face the truth, in trying to live my Rudy's life for him instead of letting him live his own. Again she paused, and her slight body grew more erect. Her eyes out at them, clear and proud. Her eyes looked out at them, clear and proud. Very well, she said. Now he is living his own. He is on the citadel. He is doing what he must do, what he was born to do. And if it's God's will, so be it. I am a woman of Kurtal, the widow of a guide, the sister of a guide, and now I'm to be the mother of a guide. May he be the best and the bravest. For a moment she looked up at the shining mountain, then back at the men around her. I shall go again to the church, she murmured. 5,000 feet up, the 4 men at the high hut were also watching the mountain. Unlike those below, they could not see the summit pyramid, but only the southeast ridge as far as the shoulder, and having no telescope, they could not in any case have been able to locate the climbers. Yet still they stared up from the outside of the doorway, as if the rising sun would reveal sign or portent on the heights above. The weather still holds. Ja. The upper snow should be firm. Ja. If they camped last night above the shoulder, they should already be... They talked, not because they had anything to say, but rather to break the stillness. For the stillness had deepened until it was monstrous and unendurable. It was almost impossible to believe that human beings lived and moved in that dead, frozen wilderness that soared above them into the sky. A previous day, according to plan, Andreas Krickel, Peter Toglich, and Klaus Wesselhoft had gone up to the base of the ridge. They had reached it about noon and remained for 5 hours, their eyes straining upward for some sign of the descending climbers. But there had been no sign, and in late afternoon they had to start down in order to reach the hut before dark. Meanwhile, old Tio had waited and waited. He had stared up at the peak until his neck ached and he was almost blinded by the fierce sunlight, and then he had gone into the hut, and with loving care he prepared a welcoming supper. But when at last, toward nightfall, he had heard footsteps and rushed outside, it was to find only the 3 who had set out that morning, and they had scarcely eaten at all. Tio himself had scarcely eaten. We will celebrate tomorrow night, they had said. Yes, tomorrow. And then they had lain down in their blankets to toss and turn throughout the endless night. Now it was tomorrow, the 3rd day, the last day. Once again they laced their boots, slung their ropes, picked up their axes, but this time as they came out from the hut, there were not 3 of them, but 4. The other 3 looked at Tio Zurbriggen. No, said Andreas Krickel, it is too far for you, too steep. Tio shook his head. I can make it. But I will not hold you back, I promise. I have done it before, and I can do it again. The others argued, but it was no use. It is not with you. Then, if it is not with you, then I will go alone, said Tio. I cannot sit here another day waiting like an old woman. He looked at them steadily, and a light kindled in his sunken eyes. I was guide of Kurtal when you could not climb to your mother's laps, and I say to you that I am coming. All the way to the ridge? Yes, to the ridge, Tio said, and if necessary further, up the ridge, to the fortress, straight on until we find them. The 3 younger men were silent. Tio jerked his rope tight over his hunched shoulder. Come on, he said. What are we waiting for? At dawn of that day, Franz Lerner had awakened in his tent above the shoulder. For long hours after the argument with Saxo, he had been awake and brooding in the darkness. But at last the tiredness of his body had outbalanced the turmoil of his thoughts, and he had slept. Then, the next thing he knew, he was awake again, and the tent was filled with gray twilight. He raised himself on one elbow, turned, and saw that Rudy was not there. At first, this did not startle him. The boy could have gone out to prepare breakfast, or to relieve himself, or simply because he was awake and restless. But then Franz saw something else. Rudy's pack was not there either. Sitting up with a jerk, he pulled on his boots and without pausing to lace them, crept quietly from the tent. The hollow outside lay emptied in dawn light. The rocks above it rose empty to the sky, and crossing to the second tent, Franz lifted the flap and peered in. Captain Winter lay where he had last seen him, wrapped in his blanket, but Saxo, like Rudy, was gone. As Franz stood there, Winter stirred and mumbled, and then he opened his eyes. "What is it?" he asked. Without answering, Franz dropped the flap and turned away. For a moment he stood as if rooted to the rocks. Then, mounting to the rim of the hollow, he followed it around, searching. He looked on all sides. Clambering onto a nearby crag, he stared up at the walls of the rock above. His lips were compressed into a thin, bloodless line, and his hands opened and closed at his side. There was a moment below as Winter crawled from his tent. "What is it?" he asked. "What's happened?" Franz came down to him. "You must not move about, my captain," he said. "Go back inside and rest." "What's happened?" Winter persisted. He looked about him. "Where are they?" "They have only—" Franz hesitated, stopped. There was no use lying, he thought. There was no lie to tell. "They've gone," he said. "Gone?" Franz nodded. "You mean up?" "Yes." "How do you know? Have you seen them?" "No, but where else would they go?" Franz recounted briefly what Saxo had threatened the night before. "And now he has done it," he said, "and that crazy boy has gone with him." "Rudy, with Saxo? Like this? I can't believe it." "Where is he, then?" asked Franz grimly. There was a silence. The dawn was brightening above them. The rocks rose bleakly into the gray stillness. With a sudden movement, Franz leapt back onto the crag on which he had stood before. "Rudy!" he shouted. "Rudy!" His voice reverberated and echoed, but there was no answer, and he cupped his hand and he yodeled, but there was no answer, and for perhaps 5 minutes he remained on the crag, calling and peering upward. Then he descended slowly to the hollow. Winter had disappeared into his tent. Franz approached it, stopped, and stood motionless, in terrible indecision. The Englishman was his heir, and too weak to go on. It was his first duty as a guide to stay with him. But if he was a guide, he was also a man, and the boy was his sister's son, his own blood, kin, climbing now, wildly, crazily, perhaps to his death. Or perhaps, he thought suddenly of Saxo, perhaps not to his death as all, but to the summit with the boaster of Broly. For a moment he thought not of the boy, but only of Saxo in his pride and his arrogance, standing triumphant on the crest of the citadel, and his fist clenched to whiteness, and the veins throbbed in his temple. No, he could not stand by helpless and beaten. It was more than flesh and blood could bear. He reached for the tent flap, but at the same instant it was opened from within, and Winter emerged, carrying his axe and pack. "All right," he said quietly, "I'm ready." Franz stared at him. "Ready?" "To go after them." Still Franz stared. He shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "No, my captain. You are too tired, too weak." "The weakness is over. I'm better now." "Yes, better, and that is good, but still you want rest. You must save your strength for the descent." Franz paused. "This is what we will do, my captain. The weather is good. You are no longer so weak. Though I do not like to leave you, you will be all right here for a few hours, and I shall go up alone." "No, Franz," said Winter. "We shall go up together." But nothing. I am better. I can make it." The two men stood facing each other in silence, and for the first time that morning, Franz really looked at Winter. Outwardly, he was much the same as on the previous night. There was the tattered clothes, the bandaged head, the hollow cheeks under the stubble of beard. And yet, Franz recognized, watching him, yet there was unmistakably a change. It was not an outer, but an inner change, a thing that could not so much be seen as simply felt. It was in his bones, in his blood, in his heart, and in his eyes. Yes, Franz thought, most of all, it was in his eyes, no longer dull and clouded as on the night before, but burning again with their old bright fire. And we are going to stop there, which is halfway through chapter 17.